Welcome to you all. Welcome back to so many of you. It's a true joy to have you here. Michael Pollan, welcome back to the new school.
Thank you, Michael.
Such a joy to have you. You first came after your first New Yorker piece, the beginning of this book, and I asked if you would come back when the book was finished, and I'm so grateful that you have. And I'm so grateful that Judith is here with you, and a warm welcome to Judith as well. We're just delighted that you're here.
Thank you. Well, that conversation we had in 2015 was, was really the first time that I had engaged in that sort of thing on this topic. This book began as an article in the New Yorker focusing on the work being done giving guided psilocybin sessions to cancer patients. And so that was kind of the logic that brought me here. And it was such a stimulating conversation that really kind of fed into the process of helping me find the book in that topic. Mm-hmm. So I thank you.
Did you have any expectation that this would be the #1 hardback bestseller on the New York Times bestseller?
No, you never have that expectation. You don't even dare have that hope. I had written, several best-selling books on food, but, Americans know how to buy a book about food. It wasn't really clear they knew how to buy a book about psychedelics. And that was a surprise, I think, to me and to the publisher and to everybody involved. It said something, though, about, I don't know exactly what it said something about, but certainly a willingness on the part of the culture to have a different kind of conversation about psychedelics. And perhaps something about, the fact that I guess I was the right messenger.
I think you were the right messenger, and I think let me start by saying, for those of you who haven't read this yet, and most of you will have copies, I devote my life to the long read. I read long books carefully, usually. And this is a magisterial book. This is an extraordinary contribution. How to Change Your Mind, What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. And it will take you, if you pay attention, quite a while to read this book because it is so rich, so deeply well-researched, so well-crafted. And I think, going back to why you were the right person to write this book, because as an atheist, as a skeptic, as a reluctant, you held that dimension of your persona as the writing persona throughout the book. And even at the end, you're still holding it. Even at the end, there isn't some ascent into a newfound transcendence. Mm-hmm. There's continuing to question and leaving it to the reader to decide what to make of it.
Yeah, well, I was all those things. Very reluctant in terms of my own psychedelic experiences, which I do detail in the book at some length. And I hadn't had them till fairly recently in life. When we met in 2015, I hadn't had these experiences yet. And so I think the fact that I was so new to this accomplished a couple different things. I wasn't thinking this way, but one was it was a door that people who are not experienced in psychedelics and might never have even occurred to them to try them, that here was somebody that would be a good guide, didn't assume too much knowledge, and because most books on the subject are really written by people already convinced of their value and from very much inside this camp of psychonauts, and I was writing from outside. I had one foot in, one foot out, and so I think that was definitely helpful. And when you're writing, we were talking about this in your office, but when you're writing a first-person book, the decision to write in the first person is just the first decision. You then have to, and this will sound weird, you have to figure out which first person am I going to write as, because you have so many choices. You have so many identities, and you have to figure out which one is relevant to the topic. And so in that sense, your first person is a very constructed thing, but it's constructed out of real, true materials. I can't write as a woman. So So you sit down and you think, well, what do I bring to this? Well, I'm someone who's passionate about nature. I think that was a really important aspect you didn't mention, and that so much of my interest in this subject flows from this deeper interest in this age-old human, and I think biological human desire or drive to change consciousness, which seems to be universal. And what is that about? And that fact that that desire drives a relationship with other species. All of us have used probably a psychoactive plant today to change consciousness, and I hope in subtle ways, but like coffee or chocolate, but also occasionally in very profound ways. And so that was part of the identity. The other part was, I was kind of a newbie and a very reluctant psychonaut, and I bring the skepticism of the journalist. You say atheist. I think that that's right. But I put it a little differently. I say in the book that I saw myself as a spiritually retarded person. And I'm a little less retarded as a result of this experience.
Commonweal has devoted the last 33 of our 43 years to, in part, but central part, to working with people with cancer. We just did our 201st week-long cancer help program in 33 years last week. And so the 8 people who came are still fresh in my mind, and many of them were dealing with profound anxiety. Many of them were dealing with depression. Many of them were dealing with existential end-of-life issues. If you had a close friend, someone you really loved, who was a skeptic about this stuff, really quite reluctant to enter into it, but who was dealing with anxiety, depression, all of those things, and they read your book and said to you, Michael, I've read the book. Should I try this? Mm-hmm. What would you say?
I would. I'm reluctant to recommend any individual do this. I think it's a decision you have to come to on your own. And the people who have success are doing it not because someone told them to, but because they realized, either because of out of desperation or curiosity or whatever the motivation. But I think it holds enormous potential for people in that situation. A lot of what got me interested in exploring the topic deeper was my interviews with cancer patients who were dealing with their mortality and hearing the kinds of experiences that they had, which were so moving, and in many cases, in about 2/3 of the cases, really transformative. The research that we discussed last time hadn't been published then, but since then it has. And of I think it's a total of about 80 cancer patients who received psilocybin sessions. And these are a single guided psilocybin session where you're prepared by a therapist, 2 therapists. They're present with you the whole time. You're wearing eye shades and listening to music to encourage a very inward journey. And afterward, these guides or therapists help you integrate the experience, figure out what it means, and figure out how to apply it to the conduct of your life. That 2/3 of those people had statistically significant reductions in standard measures of depression and anxiety. The treatment effect size was dramatic, such as we haven't seen in, I don't know, any other psychiatric intervention. It was really dramatic. Now, that's a small group. This research needs to be duplicated in larger groups. And then the anecdotal side of it, the stories people told me were just remarkable. There's one woman I talk about in the book, Dinah Baser, who is she's 60-ish New Yorker figure skating instructor who had ovarian cancer. She was treated and it was in remission, but she was, and this is a slightly different problem than the one you're talking about, but she was paralyzed by the fear of recurrence. And she could not go about her life. Even though she was supposedly cancer-free, she just was debilitated by fear. And she had no experience of psychedelics. She entered this program at NYU where they were offering this, and had an amazing, and she was an atheist, and she had this amazing experience where, like many of the cancer patients, she went into her body imaginatively. And she saw, not her cancer, but she saw this black mass under her rib cage. And she realized what it was. It wasn't her cancer, it wasn't in the right place. It was her fear. And she'd confronted her fear, and when she saw it, she screamed out in a way that shocked the two therapists, because remember, they don't know what's going on in her mind. And she suddenly said, "Get the f*** out of my body." And the black mass evaporated. And afterwards, she said that she had realized that though she couldn't control her cancer, she could control her fear. And that making that distinction, figuring out what can you control and what can't you control, had liberated her. And so in the New Yorker piece that we talked about last time I was here, I wrote Dina Bazer's fear of death or fear of recurrence was substantially diminished. And some weaselly journalistic word to slide by the fact checkers. And she, and they called her, the New Yorker fact checkers called her, and they read her the line and said, "Is this true?" And she said, "No, he got it wrong. My fear was extinguished." And I changed it. I happily changed it. But she also said something really weird, which was, she said, in describing her experience, she said, "I felt bathed in God's love." And I said, "But you told me you were an atheist." And she said, "I am an atheist, and I'm still an atheist, but I felt bathed in God's love." I said, "How do you William James said the mystical experience is paradoxical, right? This was certainly paradoxical." She said, "We just don't have a word big enough for what I felt. God is the biggest word we have, so I'm going to use that word." And it's quite beautiful. So those stories, though, are really what made me realize I needed to have this experience to see what it was about, and that it wasn't enough to relate other people's stories.
Beyond cancer, there are all these other things that you discuss, consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, transcendence. But let's just take depression and anxiety, which are widespread in the culture, perhaps even...
And rates of which are growing very quickly.
Rates of which are growing.
Yeah.
So here's a condition that we can medicalize it, and call it anxiety and depression and medicalize it, but it's an existential condition, right? So either everybody needs to go get a prescription, right? Or the culture in some way opens itself up. And you were very interesting on this because you talked about how Hoffer and Osmond, I think, discovered set and setting as critical dimensions of this.
Even though it wasn't until Timothy Leary that those words were used.
But you also talked about how other cultures have safe ritual containers for these things that we lack. Right? So here are these molecules that are accessible to us, that are being medically tested, and yet in traditional cultures they've been used for many thousands of years. How do you see the best way for our culture to open to the potential of these and at the same time create the containers of ritual and expectation that are safe enough to guide us through what is really very perilous territory when left just simply open?
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the book thinking about the lessons of the 60s. And for most people, that is when psychedelics came onto their radar. It came onto the culture's radar in a powerful way, both positively and negatively. When these drugs burst upon the West, and they really did burst upon the West, LSD is discovered, it's kind of invented in the 30s, but not discovered what it was until the 40s. When Albert Hoffman has his first LSD trip. And psilocybin doesn't really come to the West until 1957 when this very interesting character named R. Gordon Wasson, who was a banker at J.P. Morgan in New York, and an amateur mycologist goes to Mexico. He's heard rumors from Richard Evans Schultes and others that mushroom cults have survived since the Spanish conquest underground, and he finds a curandero who's willing to give him a trip, and he writes this 15-page article in Life magazine, which is a stunning piece of journalism, in 1957. So suddenly these two molecules appear, but they arrived without much context. They were just drugs, and they were used that way, and they were often used very carelessly. And the lessons of their historical context were not offered to us for various reasons. First, LSD was new. No one knew what it was for a long time. But historically, as you mentioned, for thousands of years, many cultures have used drugs we would call psychedelic, whether it was mushrooms in Central America among the Aztecs and other native populations, or the Greeks, appear to have had a psychedelic that they used at an annual rite called the Eleusinian Mysteries. It was called the Kikion. We don't know what was in the potion, but people traveled to other worlds and met the dead and went to the underworld, and so it sounds pretty psychedelic. It wasn't wine. And all these groups who used these substances did it with enormous care and scrupulous attention. There was always an elder involved, right? Somebody who knew the territory who was guiding people who were new. There was always, as you say, ritual and ceremony attached to it. You only did it at certain points, either to heal someone or because it was an annual ritual. So they had these cultural containers, and I think that's a reflection of their appreciation of the power and dangers of these substances. In fact, it was a capital crime in Greece to have anything to do with the Kikion outside of this one rite once a year. For us, the molecules kind of arrived unclothed, right? They didn't have this, and I think that was part of what led to, the casualties that were a real phenomenon in the 60s. Although I should say that's, often exaggerated for political effect. But, the fact is there were people who had psychotic breaks and things like that. And there were a handful of suicides. So the job now is, I think, to get back to your question, how do we devise an appropriate container for our culture? Because those cultures, they're not our cultures. We don't have shamans. We have doctors. And so one path we're on is devising a medical container. And that's all this research is on a traditional FDA track. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, recognition by the FDA that this is a medicine, rescheduling. And there'll be regulations written onto who can prescribe these and under what circumstances. And I describe what that protocol looks like. As you suggest, it was really invented in the mid-50s, perfected, you could say. But it's the two therapists in the room. It's the eye shades, the music, a certain kind of preparation, certain kind of integration. It's a psychotherapeutic paradigm, and it's important to understand it's not simply the administration of a drug. It shouldn't be called psychedelic therapy. It should be called psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, because it really is a package. Even though when you're doing your FDA test, you play that down because their model is for testing a drug. But everyone involved appreciates, I think, the critical value of the guide. How those guides should be trained, should they have a license of some kind, should they necessarily be psychotherapists, all that is up for grabs. So there will be this medical container, and it will have the power of Western shamanism behind it. Because fact is, when someone with an MD gives you a drug, it's much more likely to work than if I did. And there's a lot of power in that white coat. But is that the only container? Do we need another container for what one of the researchers memorably called the betterment of well people? And that there's, a lot of the people involved in getting this research off the ground and even the researchers feel strongly that the value of these medicines extends beyond people who are, clinically depressed or suffering from cancer or whatever it is, and that we're all facing mortality, not just cancer patients. Many people are dealing with depression or sadness, the kinds of disconnection that I think are common to depression and addiction and anxiety. And so how do you make it available to them? And that's the cultural work that I think needs to be done. I can imagine someday that there might be mental health spas where people go and there's a doctor who is the prescribing doctor on staff or on call, and that there are trained guides of some kind who help people have these experiences. I've met people who want to set those up, and that may happen. I mean, the fact is, people who are not very ill have access to prescription psychoactive drugs, SSRIs, right? I mean, doctors hand those out all the time. And people who aren't clinically ill get great benefit from psychotherapy, right? For sadness, for relationship problems, all the reasons people go see shrinks. And those people too may have this available to them because doctors can prescribe off-label once things are approved. So I think it remains to be seen exactly what that container will be. I think that's very exciting cultural work that will have to happen. I mean, there are oncologists figuring out how to bring this into their practice. You could easily see that at a retreat center like this, if you were working with a doctor who could organize that kind of experience for people coming to your retreats. I think hospices, that it will be something that's available there too. All of this is assuming that the next phase of trials, which are going to be a lot bigger, has results comparable to what we've seen so far, obviously. We're not there yet. We haven't proven this to the satisfaction of the FDA. And by we, I mean they.
Well, that's an actually interesting point that I don't want to dwell on too much, but I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on John Stuart Mill, and one of his fundamental tenets was the right that we have to decide what we do with our own bodies. It's a fundamental principle of English jurisprudence. And I believe in the right to decide what we do with our own bodies, and therefore I have to interrogate whether the FDA overall, in the way it's operated, serves us or disserves us to what degree, because it really is an abrogation of our right to decide what we do with our own bodies in many, many ways.
But it protects us too.
It protects us
from quacks and snake oil.
It does protect us. And then there's the balance of those things that it either retards because nobody's going to do the trials because they're natural products or whatever.
And they're too expensive.
Or they're too expensive. So anyway, that's another subject.
I think it is a question. I mean, so what about outright legalization? My concern, I mean, there are good arguments in favor of legalizing drugs. I mean, it's very interesting to watch the experience in Portugal, which is actually not legalization, it's decriminalization. Yeah. And if you want to read about a model, that's an interesting one to look at. But I don't know that the cannabis model is right for drugs this powerful. I really don't. And, from my experience, I think that there is a place for greater regulation. The interesting problem with prohibition is you can't have regulation, right? It's kind of everything or nothing goes. Whereas if you do legalize, you can regulate. Who has access to these drugs, what kind of training might be required. And that's probably what we need. But I think that right now the path we're on, people are trying to put psilocybin on ballot initiatives. I think that's a mistake right now. I don't think enough people even know what it is. When you do something prematurely, you lock politicians into positions that becomes very hard for them to get out.
That's really true.
Think about, Obama and gay marriage, right? Yeah. I mean, when that first came on, politicians had to take negative positions that they then took a lot of work for them to unwind. So I think the fact is, I mean, the important thing to know is the FDA has been remarkably supportive of this research, which I think is probably a recognition of the desperation of the mental health community for some new tools. because the tools that they have now are showing are a little threadbare. The SSRIs are fading their effectiveness. People don't like being on them. The side effects are really serious, and they're very hard to get off. And their effectiveness is questionable. They definitely help some people for certain periods of time. So that big pharma is not developing new CNS drugs. They're disinvested in central nervous system drugs. So here comes this from out of left field, these nonprofits essentially who are promoting the research, MAPS, which is tabling downstairs, and Hefter Institute and USONA Institute, all with private money, by the way. Big pharma is not paying for any of this research, and that the money has been raised, in a lot of it from the tech community in the Bay Area, but from other people as well. That they're open. They're surprisingly open. And why should that be? Well, it is the desperation. And I also think, frankly, and this is the positive legacy of Timothy Leary, that enough people in positions of power have had psychedelic experiences that they don't react as they did 30 or 40 years ago. And that without doubt, there are people, drug regulators at the FDA who've, tripped. And this influences their reactions.
There are so many narratives woven into this book. The accidental discoveries, whether in the lab or, as you mentioned, in Mexico, the progress of science and the initial openness, the Great Repression, the distorted Timothy Leary narrative, the science that continued after the Great Repression began, the formation and maintenance of the psychedelic underground, the story of MAPS and other organizations in their dogged pursuit of recovery of the promise, how psilocybin disables the ego and creates these death rebirth experiences, the many forms of psychedelics, the role of psychedelics in jump-starting neuropsychiatric studies. But I'd like to start with one of my favorites, or go to one of my favorites, the stoned ape theory. What was that all about?
You went to the least plausible part of the whole book. Well, Terence Mckenna. How many people have heard of Terence Mckenna? Oh my God, only in Bolinas. I could ask that question any other place and I'd get a smattering of hands. So Terence Mckenna was a very charismatic, in many ways brilliant psychonaut who had many theories about psychedelics and their role in human evolution, all of which are highly speculative. To be generous, and one of them is this, and you can hear. You should go on YouTube and just spend an hour watching Terence do his thing. And the stoned ape theory is his theory that it was magic mushroom, psilocybin, that really kick-started the human consciousness and language and just about everything you could think of that you like about humanity. And the theory was that that we discovered psychedelics very early on. And in fact, there are apes who like psychedelics and eat magic mushrooms when they can find them. And that it gave us an edge. People who took them had an edge. They were slightly better hunters. At low doses, their sensory acuity was better. So this may be the preference. But the experience it had on their minds was that his theory was that language was a form of synesthesia. Synesthesia is the cross-wiring of different senses, so that when you can smell a musical sound or see a note, that's synesthesia. And it's a very common experience on psychedelics. And he said language was a special case of synesthesia. You had this meaningless noise, and then you connected it to a concept, and it was the drug that allowed you to connect it, and that's the stoned ape. And language leads to the growth of the human brain and self-consciousness. I have an easier time imagining that psychedelics contributed to cultural evolution than biological evolution. The one thing I can't follow, and maybe other people can follow it better than I can, is how these changes would end up in the genome. That the selective pressure, that the people who had this experience we're so much more successful. I just don't see it. But, I think in terms of cultural evolution, I think psychedelics may well have played a profound part. Another theory that McKenna held, but a lot of other people held too, is that psychedelics may have been involved in the whole idea of religion, or the whole idea that there is another world, a beyond. Where do you get a weird idea like that? That there is a heaven and a hell. And many people on psychedelics have emerged with the sense that, oh my God, this world as it presents it to our senses in everyday normal consciousness is not the only world. And that's a core idea of so many religions. And that the mystical experience occasioned by psychedelics is at the core of so many religions. I find that completely plausible, totally unprovable, but plausible. So I do think they have a role. I think of drugs like psychedelics, but other ones too. I think this is true of opium. I think it's probably true of cannabis. Is that I think of them as mutagens in the cultural sense. If you accept the idea that there are genes here and then there are memes here in culture, what mutates a meme? We know what mutates a gene: solar radiation, chemicals, and things like that. Pure chance. But drugs do mutate memes. Coleridge's idea of the secondary consciousness, secondary imagination. There were two ideas of imagination. One is a distortion of what is as a producer of new ideas and beauty and things like that. That idea very much owes to his dabbling in, or more than dabbling in, opium. So I think that I'm more comfortable looking at cultural evolution rather than biological evolution, but who knows? I mean, maybe.
Well, there's genetics, but then there's epigenetics.
Yeah.
And epigenetics is the place where culture and genetics mix. And in fact, it's really the inheritance of acquired characteristics is what epigenetics is beginning to re-demonstrate after, hundreds of years of dismissal.
It's not as neat a distinction as we think.
Right. And
but that language could be inherited through epigenetics. I don't know. Do we have any evidence of that?
No, but your broader point, which is that there's a whole set of animals, not just apes, that like to ingest these things, and therefore it's not just human. It's a whole set of critters that like to do this.
And it would seem maladaptive, right? Because you are somewhat debilitated.
Right.
You're easier prey, right, for your predator. Nevertheless, this is very common. So it must have, if we haven't acquired an aversion to these drugs, they must have some adaptive value. And I think they do have adaptive value for individuals and for cultures.
Yeah. Now, McKenna's theory of the stoned ape was continued by a most remarkable man, Paul Stamets, who you spent some time with.
Yeah.
And let's talk a little about Paul Stamets. For one thing,
How many people have heard of Paul Stamets?
Yeah, there we go.
I will tell him. So Paul is a visionary mycologist who, when I decided I was going to look at psilocybin closely, I'm always interested in the natural history of whatever I write about. I mean, my master theme is nature and our engagement with the natural world. So when I realized psilocybin was going to be at the heart of this book, I wanted to learn about the mushroom. And Paul Stamets literally wrote the book on psilocybin. In the late 70s, he writes a field guide to psilocybes. There are about 150 to 200 different species of mushrooms that produce psilocin and psilocybin, the two chemicals in it. And so we went mushroom hunting together. I wasn't sure he was open to this. He's kind of like, he has a company now. He's kind of, he's doing all this straight ahead research into how to apply mushrooms to solve. I mean, he believes that mushrooms really can solve all the world's problems, and he makes very large claims for mushrooms, which I always thought were like, come on. But actually, if you go one by one through the various claims he's made, they hold up. That's the thing with these visionaries, So I said, could we go mushroom hunting together? And we did, and we spent this wonderful weekend in, I can't tell you where, he made me promise not to, but somewhere near the mouth of the Columbia River, where there is a species of psilocybe called azurescens. It's the only place it's ever been found, and it was found by him and identified by him and written up by him and named by him for his son, Azurius, who in turn was named for the color that psilocybin mushrooms bruise. So it's this weird sort of circular naming. We need a word in English for that. And we went hunting for these, and they're the most potent psilocybe known ever. And so we went hunting, and we found some. Not a great number, but we found them. I learned from that experience never to hunt my own psilocybes, that there are ones that look exactly like them that lead to, as the field guides say, an agonizing death. So you want to be careful. There are certain kinds that grow in like cow patties and stuff that are pretty easy to identify, but not these. So yeah, so we had a wonderful weekend, and I was very excited when we found them. And then as we were having dinner around the campfire, we also went hunting for razor clams, which we found. He said, yes, not everybody likes them. They're a little too strong for some people. I said, oh yeah, and he said, yeah, they have a side effect some people don't like. I said, what is that? Paralysis. I said, I could see why people would like be troubled by that. And he said it goes away, but. So anyway, I learned a lot about mushrooms from him, and he has Alex Gray painting of the stoned ape in his house, and he was incredibly generous with his knowledge, and great company too. If you ever have a chance to hear him speak, I highly recommend it.
Psilocybin also has the characteristic, according to Stamets, that it shows up at places that the earth has been wounded by human habitation. Yeah. It shows up at the edge of parking lots, where there are Winnebagos, you may find psilocybin. Yeah. It shows up.
He said at one point, this is the only time I've ever heard Paul Stamets make a joke. He's a very earnest person. He said, one of the indicator species for psilocybin are Winnebagos. And we did find some. They were, I thought we'd have to go into the wildest places, but they were like right near the yurts and the parking lots and things like that. And why is that? Because people carry them around. And, whenever you carry a mushroom, you are trailing spores, right? They're invisible, but they're always there.
Is it because people carry them around?
Well, people pick them and move them. And so they end up being where we are. They're in that sense, they're weedy. They're one of those species that benefits from our engagement with them. And the reason that you find these psilocybes now all over the world has to do with the fact that people have probably moved them.
Okay, so it isn't because they like to live, like you said, some species show up in cow pies, for example.
Yeah, there's certain species that's what they need.
But I wonder if it's kind of the, like the lotus blooming out of, dirty water and stuff. I wonder whether, I'm open to the fact that it's because people carry them around, but I wonder whether they selectively do best in degraded environments.
Yeah, I don't know that. They may be. Paul really thinks that they're a message from nature for us.
Well, that's why I wondered.
Yeah, and that one of the things these mushrooms do to people is change your thinking about the natural world, and I definitely had that experience. We ingested some of these psilocybe azurescens, not enough to get paralyzed. You'd be glad to hear, and I had a very profound experience of nature in my garden. We were in Connecticut, and. One of the things that psychedelics do, I think, is change your sense of the subject-object relationship. And instead of thinking, as most of us do, as most of our egos do most of the time, that we are the only thinking, perceiving subject, everything else is an object, including other people, for some of us, that you are acutely aware of the subjectivity, the fact that other species, the fact that plants have their own point of view and agency, and they don't have consciousness the way we do, but they have an awareness of their environment, ability to respond. And these are ideas I understood intellectually. I'd written about plant intelligence before. I'd written in Botany and Desire, A Plant's Eye View of the World is the subtitle of that book. So I understood this as an idea, but I never felt it. It was not an idea that had that kind of emotional power for me. And it did on this experience. And it's very hard to objectify nature after a psychedelic experience, I think, if that's been your focus in the experience. And you know, that's our problem, you know? I mean, in terms of the environmental crisis, that disconnection from nature, the fact that we can treat it as an object for our exploitation, extraction, you know, the fact that we can take animals and put them into confinement agriculture situations, you know, that kind of brutality flows from not according the pig any subjectivity, any spirit, right? And this isn't just my experience. This is very common. In fact, it's been measured. The psychologists have, of course, a rating scale for everything, and they have one for nature relatedness, and that is the extent to which you feel you're part of nature or standing outside of nature. And if you give that scale to somebody before and after a psilocybin experience, as has been done at Imperial College in London, nature relatedness goes up quite a bit. And so in that sense, Paul's right. I mean, that the mushrooms are bringing us a message from nature. I mean, that's a kind of poetic way to put it, but they have the potential to reset people's attitudes toward the natural world. Now, whether that's enduring or temporary is a question, and I think they have a huge implication for other problems like that. I mean, you know, I really think the two biggest problems we face are the environmental crisis, which flows from this disconnection from nature, and the other would be tribalism, which flows from a disconnection with other people. They're very similar phenomena, and an objectification of other people that allows you to detest them or build walls against them, or all the things that, you know, we see happening right now. And that we also see that the kinds of connections that a high-dose psychedelic experience, and I'm talking about one where ego defenses are eliminated, which is what seems to happen in the people who have the most successful outcomes, that opens up channels through which emotions like love flow more freely and makes people feel that they're more like the other than they ever realized before. So we can all think of someone who could benefit from this sort of experience.
You know, like you, I did psychedelics twice in my life, once in New Haven, LSD, and once in my early years out here, 43 years ago with psilocybin. And they were both good experiences. But then the last 40 years or more, I haven't. Barely touched cannabis either. And part of that for me is that I'm deeply interested in spiritual life, but I like my spiritual life to be earned as opposed to, you know, in pill form or whatever. At the same time, because I keep thinking about whether I want to try this again, and I haven't done it. And having read your book, I still don't know if I want to do it. But your book made me interrogate that question more. And so you mentioned that Stamets sees these as psilocybin as messengers from God or nature. Spinoza said God is nature. So, and so the question really is, because you say, as you say, it's environment and tribalism that are our biggest issues, but I happen to be spending time looking at the question of civilizational collapse and the whole range of 15, 20, 30 different vectors, you know, environmental, political, economic, social, all of them taking this very, very fragile civilizational structure that we've created, and any set of combinations could really bring it down, And then suddenly, in this relatively brief period of historic time, these molecules show up. One of them invented, but the other ancient. And so, you know, the question, the metaphysical question really is, are these messengers? And Stamets seems to me to be an example of that. And you point out that, is the word fungi, is that how you say the plural?
I think so, fungi or fungi, yeah.
Yeah. You point out that actually we have more in common biologically with fungi than we do with the vegetable kingdom. And that they have this ability to enter us at a very deep level. So the question, you know, I'd like to spend our last 10 minutes on in some way is not that I expect that you will endorse that perspective, because I don't think you would, and I'm not sure it would do any good. But as a cultural meme, let us say, as a cultural meme, as a container, imagine that we created a cultural container that said, under the right circumstances, these really are messengers, because our situation, I mean, leave aside our present political situation, since it's happening all over the world, it's not just the United States. Right. Are these messengers? And do they have agency, as you put it? And are they inviting us to a collaboration to find the best way out?
I mean, the honest answer is I don't know.
Right.
I would not call them. I would not call them messengers. I would call them tools. Tools that may have come along at just the right time, as tools often do, and that they happen to address a lot of the most acute problems we face. But they do that in individuals, and it's a huge leap to go from treating individuals to treating a civilization, or even a community. And this was something that, you know, people grappled with in the 60s. I mean, you know, Timothy Leary was working out calculations on napkins about how many people you would have to turn on to actually shift the course of civilization. And, you know, even the researchers, the very sober researchers I interviewed here, will tell you, if you get them, you know, out for a drink, that these drugs do have implications at the civilizational level. But how do you get there? We don't really have a model for treating everybody. Fluoride is the closest thing we have. Putting this in the water seems ill-advised for all the reasons we were talking about earlier. So I just don't know. I think it's incredibly intriguing. I'm really struck by the fact that they do seem to have, our interest in them is blossoming again at a time when we are in this incredible moment of crisis, and that they can help us think about it, and not just think about it, but feel about it differently. And so one of the big debates in the 60s and the 50s was when LSD came along, people had the same thought you just had, which was that, oh my God, this is what we need. This could change civilization. I tell the story of before Timothy Leary, Al Hubbard, this, you know, Christian mystic, spy, inventor, rum runner, I mean, you'll read about him. He's the most interesting character in the history of, he makes Leary's story seem boring. He too realized that and he had gotten a message from an angel who told him that he could get involved with something that was going to change the course of civilization. But his theory was turn on the elite, right? Turn on the best and the brightest, and let this consciousness filter down. So he gave it to computer engineers and artists and people in the church, in the Catholic Church. And Leary was more of a populist. He was like bottom up. They both, you know, I mean, neither succeeded finally in that. But that's the hard work that, you know, we have this tool. It's highly relevant to tasks we need to achieve, accomplish. But how do we best use it? And there, I don't know. I'm
funny
really curious.
That you prefer the word tool, having said earlier that these plants have their own consciousness and their own agency. So it's just interesting to me
Yeah.
that you prefer the tool meme to the messenger meme, since they do have consciousness and agency according to your perception.
Yeah, but I wouldn't. I think their agency is as far as I know,
Yeah.
is kind of more about reproducing themselves,
Yeah.
succeeding in nature, getting more habitat,
Yeah.
doing all the things that corn has, for
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
done. But whether their agency includes changing the minds of the species that's f***ing up their habitat, it's a beautiful idea, but you started by describing me as an atheist and a skeptic, and that's who I am.
Well, it's interesting on my part too, because I'm actually a skeptic about whether turning a whole bunch of people on would change the civilization. Although that percent, interestingly, researchers think is about 3.5% of
Really?
the population. Yeah, that's the figure, that if 3.5% of the population become deeply committed to a social change idea, it tends to happen.
Well, we have a plan.
Yeah. But part of my issue with that is that when I look at the people who have done a lot of this stuff, I don't regularly notice that they're much better human beings after than before. I mean, some of them are, but an awful lot of them aren't. They've had.
So this is another paradox of psychedelic experience, that this drug, which at high doses is often correlated with, sometimes it's called the mystical experience, in more psychodynamic terms is the dissolution of ego, has produced some tremendous egotists.
Yeah.
And so there's something that happens. I mean, Leary is a great example. You feel, I think, that you've been given a precious key to the meaning of everything. And that leads to an ego inflation, even if that key was the ego is your problem. So it's a paradox. It definitely is a paradox. And but I take your point.
Speaking of cultural containers, I gave a talk this morning at the Integral Yoga Institute in San Francisco on the 3 yogas of the Bhagavad Gita. And I was researching that, and I was doing this afternoon, and I thought, gee, I wonder if Arjuna's vision of Krishna in his full beauty, which looked a lot like an entheogenic psychedelic experience, wasn't induced by entheogens. So I Googled it, and lo and behold, there's a whole theory that the Gita is, in fact, an entheogenic vision. And I asked Swami Ramananda, who runs the Integral Yoga Institute, how widespread this view is. And he says, yeah, it's in the sutras. So. And then you said about...
There's a lot of buried psychedelic use
there's
in
a
the
lot of
history of
buried,
religion.
and you said, that the Christian benediction of blood and the body of Christ, the cup of salvation, is sort of a watered down version of that experience. So I wonder, and I just wonder, whether, we live in a period of the apotheosis of doubt, right? Doubt has become our default, that if I are designed, trained to doubt, right? But I wonder if a return not to belief in the cognitive sense, perhaps not even to faith in the deeper sense, but to trust in the deepest sense, I wonder whether some return to trust in the healing power of nature, and that the way out, and then that brings me back to wonder whether nature itself, even though I'm skeptical about tripping our way out of this, but whether that communion, which you said is characteristic of the psilocybin experience, whether that deep communion with nature, the trust, might somehow reorient us, might somehow take us away from the apotheosis of doubt back into a recognition that, nature is beautifully designed and it has agency. And perhaps somehow with prayer, this might reorient us.
Let me say 2 things about that. First, I think you should re-examine your idea that drugs represent a form of cheating compared to the hard work of meditation and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, there's assumptions built into that are a little bit Puritan, it is a shortcut in that sense, and it's been a shortcut for a lot of people that has kicked off the hard work of meditation and things like that. But that doesn't change the nature of the experience. I don't think it makes one better or worse. Houston Smith wrote about this quite a bit, and he said, it's for all intents and purposes, it's indistinguishable, a mystical experience achieved using a molecule versus, and Aldous Huxley wrote about this too, that whatever that hard work experience is finally a neurochemical experience in the brain, and there are many ways to get there. But we assume that the harder you work, the more legitimate the experience is. So just raising that as a question.
That's helpful. I take that.
On the trust issue, I think that's really interesting. You use the word trust and not faith. One of the things that in the preparation sessions that happens is that you are encouraged to trust and to surrender to the experience, which is the hardest thing for people to do. So what the guides will tell you at the beginning is that when you see anything frightening, don't turn and run from it. The worst thing you could do, if you feel you're going crazy, if you feel you're dying, if you feel your sense of self dissolving, go with it. Surrender, trust. And that's the key to a positive experience. And there's one person I interviewed in the book who was a philosopher at Johns Hopkins, I think, and he played with this idea during his experience, and he was having these very kind of frightening moments. And there are moments where anxiety builds and you see something really terrifying. And resistance leads to a lot of anxiety during the experience. If you try to defend your ego as it's dissolving, you'll be very unhappy. But he realized that this whole principle of surrender was a life principle, not just a technique for getting through a psychedelic experience, and that sort of trust in what was happening to him, in what the mushroom was doing to him, was a really important takeaway for him. And that was that's what he tried to apply to his life and his philosophy. So I think that's a really intriguing idea.
Well, I take your first point, and the second point is, of course, that surrender, complete surrender to the divine, and the dissolution of ego is also at the heart of the spiritual paths.
For me, the big change, I mean, my transformation intellectually came from my understanding of what spiritual means.
Yeah.
I had always assumed spiritual and supernatural were very closely allied, and that on the other side was materialism. And that and the reason I was so spiritually retarded, as I said at the beginning, was the fact that I just don't accept the supernatural. I tend to think the laws of nature will at some point be able to explain everything. And but what I learned from my own experience, and I had one very profound experience of ego dissolution, where my sense of self just completely, was gone, and I beheld the world from a different perspective that wasn't my ego. Was that the opposite term of spiritual is not material; it was egotistical, and it is ego consciousness that prevents the kind of profound connections to the other, whether it's other people, through love, or nature, through a sense of absolute kinship, that it's the ego that patrols those borders and that keeps us from making those connections. And that when you can actually put down those barriers, those defenses, is when the spiritual connections flow. And that was like, oh, that's what spiritual is, at least for me. Yeah. And that was an important learning. And I do have the psilocybin to thank for that.
Yeah. I will wait to thank you until the end, but at this point, and I thank you, but I'd like to open this up, and we will ask people who'd like to ask you questions to line up to do that.
I think I will stand for that.
Yeah, Tina, you're first.
I would be so interested to hear you cross-reference Eilert Waldman's A Really Good Day and Johann Hari's Lost Connections.
What was the second name? Johann?
Johann Hari, Lost Connections.
Oh, I don't know that book.
Oh, goody.
Oh, yes, the book on depression. Yes.
Well, and anxiety. And,
Yes, I haven't read that book. I've read his work on addiction. I think he's a really interesting writer.
Yes.
So Ayelet Waldman wrote a book last year called A Really Good Day, and she's writing about microdosing and her experience. Microdosing is the use of, I won't ask how many people have heard of microdosing. But it's a very different approach to psychedelics, where you take a small dose, like 10 micrograms, which is like a tenth of a moderate dose, every couple days. Or you do it with psilocybin. And it's not enough to render you ineffective in your everyday life. But supposedly is very helpful to people dealing with depression and anxiety, and makes them people report feeling much more creative, and adds a little sparkle to life. It's really intriguing, the anecdotes, and her anecdote is very powerful, that it really was healing for her, and it's a book well worth reading. But it's important to note that there is absolutely no research on microdosing. There's never been a controlled trial. There are a couple that are contemplated now that may get underway soon, and we'll get a lot more information, but it could be purely a placebo effect, or it could be something meaningful. It strikes me as a classic fate it's what capitalism does with a drug as disruptive and transformative as LSD, which is to turn it into another productivity drug, like Ritalin or SSRIs or whatever. Just drugs that allow people to function more in the system as it is, rather than questioning the system as it is. But okay, you can have both. So we'll see. So I didn't give it, I talk about it in the book, but not at great length, because I really did try to stay, deal with the science. And everything I'm writing about is stuff we do have surprisingly good research about.
Well, my question is that back in the 60s when I did more psychedelics, my experience was always, visual. That's what I remember going forward. And one experience was actually drawing and seeing the line from my pen just continue the drawing as I stood there watching this still pen, which affected me hugely. And today I think it's like I still remember that experience when I get caught with, you can't do this, or that fear factor. So I wondered if those kind of experiences really transform us at that moment going forward. What, those very particular ones, like the woman with her dark spot.
Yeah. So what endures, you mean?
So if that in effect is something that is invited in, let's say, a transformative experience for someone, is that a factor? Is that talked about? Is that visual understanding? Just like when you were talking about the communion with nature, I remember that aura around leaves that were alive, and that picture is what stays with me. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about the visual.
Yeah, so a couple points about visuals. One is that the guided experiences tend to be somewhat less visual, in that you're wearing eye shades and you're not dealing with visual information coming in. It's all imagined or previously experienced visual imagery. Nevertheless, there is sometimes very powerful visual material. I had a couple experiences on ayahuasca that were, what remains of them is a couple images, and that they're almost like visual koans that I think about a lot, because I don't know what they mean. Right. Like yours. I mean, that sounds like a kind of stunning experience. I had this experience. I was doing ayahuasca in a situation where traditionally you do it overnight and it's dark, and it should be dark, but we had to start before it got dark, and so we were wearing eye shades. And the bands on these eye shades, these black eye shades, were very tight, and I could feel them on my temple. And gradually they turned into steel bars, and the bars multiplied, going all the way down my body. And I was trapped in this steel cage that corseted me very tightly, and it was potentially a terrifying image. And then I looked down, and I saw at my feet this little green shoot, and this plant, this vine, starts winding up along the bars, using the bars in a positive way, right, to get access to the sunlight, and showing me a way out. But it wasn't a way I could follow. And I kept thinking, well, only plants can't be caged. Only animals can be caged. You can tell me what that means.
So do you think the visual was something you would take forward easier than a, let's say, awareness or revelation?
Yeah. I mean, one of the theories of psychedelics that a Brazilian neuroscientist offered to me that I mentioned in the book in passing, and we can't prove this, is that you see your thoughts very often. And one of the curious things that we know from neuroscience is that whether you're seeing me now or remembering seeing me tomorrow, this exact same circuits in your visual cortex are activated, which suggests something is suppressing your ability to see me tomorrow. That we should be seeing our thoughts all the time, but it would be impossible to drive a car. I mean, think about how maladaptive that would be. So that there's something repressing our ability to see our thoughts and our memories in this very vivid way. And that psychedelics may release that. It's an interesting theory. Yeah, sure.
Hi. Two things. The MAPS program, which works with in similar ways with therapy, except they use MDMA.
Yeah.
And then with the program now you're talking about is with psilocybin. What I'm wondering, within the realm of PTSD, which both of them speak to and work with, just your thoughts.
Sure. Trauma. So MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, the organization that's tabling downstairs, has focused their work, Rick Doblin founded it in 1986, has focused their work on MDMA, or ecstasy, which is a powerful therapeutic drug that was used, in fact, commonly in therapy, especially in the Bay Area, until it was made illegal. It became a party drug. In 1985, it was made illegal. The qualities of MDMA are somewhat different than psychedelics. I don't consider it a psychedelic. Rick considers it a psychedelic, but he considers almost everything a psychedelic, including cannabis. But it works on a different set of brain receptors, and the experience is, I'm told, different. I've never tried it. It's particularly useful in dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder because it appears to deactivate the fight or flight response. And then it allows people to take very painful memories out and look at them without the emotional charge that's gotten attached to them. And then when they store them again or reconsolidate them, some of that charge has been lost. And I've seen videotapes of MAPS studies with soldiers, Iraqi and Afghan war veterans, where people bring out their most traumatic memories, and they have had terrific success. In a fairly large phase 2 study, 2/3 of the trauma victims that they worked with, after 2 or 3 sessions on MDMA with a psychiatrist, no longer had symptoms of PTSD on the scale of PTSD symptoms. That's amazing. We don't have another tool like that. So that research is now moving into phase 3, and that'll start this summer. And of all these alternative therapies using these illegal drugs, that'll probably be the one that will be approved first, because the need is so acute for soldiers, for victims of sexual abuse, and it appears to be very, very effective. Trauma does come up with other psychedelics too. I've talked to people who, on ayahuasca in particular, will often surface forgotten traumas, which can make the experience difficult. And that's another argument, at least when you're doing these high dose experiences, for having a guide, because who knows what's going to come up, and you might need help dealing with it. Yes?
On behalf of my sister, I wonder if you have any information on psychedelic trials or even anecdotes that relate to Alzheimer's and other dementias.
Yeah, so there's some talk about doing some studies around psychedelics and dementia and Alzheimer's. Nothing's really gotten off the ground yet. There was a research study that was published last week in Cell magazine that had some very provocative findings that psychedelics, including psilocybin, LSD, MDMA too, in this study, I think, encouraged the branching of brain cells. Additional neurites and dendrites were formed. Now, this was found in mice or rats and fruit flies and in test tubes. So it's a long way from being proven in humans, but it's very suggestive. And that there's in depression, I know, and this is probably true in dementia too, there's a pruning, an over pruning of connections between neurons. And so that if something like this could contribute to neuroplasticity, that might suggest some pathways for new drugs. But it's all still in a very speculative place, but there are definitely people thinking about the question you're thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has been fantastic. I'm a doctor of Chinese medicine, and thinking of psychedelics as a therapy or as a medicine moving forward, you had said that there are not many good examples. What guidelines or what elements would you hope the healthcare industry considers as we move to the coming years?
Well, I mean, I encourage them to be open to it. I mean, the psychiatric establishment, still, there was somebody did a survey recently of psychiatrists, and a lot of their thinking about psychedelics is kind of stuck in, circa 1965. I described a psychedelic experience of my own in an article in the New York Times 3 or 4 weeks ago, and a psychiatrist, a prominent psychiatrist from the University of Pennsylvania, wrote in to warn people because you could have a psychotic episode like Michael Pollan did. And, if you think about psychedelic experience through the lens of diagnostic criteria for psychosis, you could easily be fooled, right? You're seeing things that aren't there. You're hearing voices that aren't there. Your personality is dissolving. Yeah, it sounds like psychosis, but it's not. So what does that tell you? Well, look at your criteria. So there's a lot of that kind of thinking that's going on. So I think open-mindedness. There are other people in the field, though, that are much more open. In general, there are people who've had the experience. And when psychedelics first came on the scene, people called them psychotomimetics, in that they seem to mimic psychosis. On paper, it's certainly what it looked like. And the original thinking that was LSD would be good to help us understand schizophrenia because the doctors could have a schizophrenic experience and be more empathic. And then the doctors started taking the medicine and realized, no, this isn't psychosis, this is something else. And they moved on from that paradigm. So I guess open-mindedness would be the key and realize that, that these drugs deserve just a clear-eyed look that's not freighted with the moralism and the kind of the moral panic that surrounded them in the 60s. So thanks.
Thank you.
Hi. This has been a great talk. Thanks very much. In terms of open-mindedness, my wife and I were just whispering in the audience, and I said, I like him. He's kind of a skeptic. And she said, he's very open-minded. And I said, well, he's not so open-minded that his brain falls out. So I really appreciate this kind of scientific approach that you're taking. I think it's really interesting. I'm a big fan of Sam Harris. I know you're on his podcast recently, and I haven't listened to it yet. But he has a very, very similar stance around psychedelics, I think. And he draws a very interesting connection between meditation and taking psychoactive drugs, and the connection being kind of this dissolution of the self that you were talking about. This, ego fades away, and we see things very subjectively. So I'm just curious how you see, or if you see, like the intersection of those things as therapies or as practices. Can they be used? Should they be used together? And maybe that's obvious, but how do you see those kind of playing together?
It's a great question. So one of the really interesting findings from the research, when they began doing fMRI imaging of people who were tripping, they would actually give you an injection of psilocybin or LSD and slide you into the tube, the fMRI tube. Can you imagine? We owe a debt to these volunteers. Nobody's willing to volunteer for that, I can tell. And they made these images of the brains, and they were very surprised to find that one particular brain network was downregulated dramatically. It's something called the default mode network. And it's I had never heard of it. And in fact, the researcher who did this research had to look it up and figure out what was going on. But it's a network it's in the midline, and it connects parts of the cortex, which is, executive function, the evolutionarily most recent, it's what's big in humans, is the cortex, to older, deeper regions involved in memory and emotion. And it's a hub in the brain, very important transit hub, and it's a regulator of global mental activity. It's one researcher called it the orchestra conductor. This goes offline during a high-dose psychedelic experience, and it correlates with people's feeling of ego dissolution. So what does the default mode network do? Well, it's involved in self-reflection. It's involved in theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states to others, very important in moral reasoning and things like that. It's involved in time travel, the ability to think about the past or the future. And it's involved in something called the experiential or narrative self, kind of where we generate the stories of who we are that gives us that sense of continuity over time. At the same time this work was going on at Imperial College London, there was a neuroscientist and psychiatrist at Yale named Judd Brewer who was imaging the brains of very experienced meditators. People with 10,000 hours of meditation, he slid them into the machine and had them meditate. And their brains looked identical. The same networks were being turned off. And so it suggests deep connections between psychedelic experience and meditation. And that I interviewed Judd Brewer and spent some time in his lab in Massachusetts. He's now at UMass. And he felt that there was a role for psychedelics in kickstarting the meditation process for people, which is historically exactly what happened. I mean, a great number of the best-known American Buddhists, people like Jack Kornfeld, Joan Halifax, began with psychedelics. And they were looking for a way to, you can't do psychedelics every day. They're not a practice. And so meditation became the way to achieve similar states of consciousness, egolessness, in everyday life. And I think that the presence and influence of American Buddhism and mindfulness. John Kabat-Zinn too talked to me about his important psychedelic experiences early on. I think. And it is how I've been able to carry forward a lot of what I learned. It has made me a better meditator. And that I think once having had a sense, somebody told me last night the Buddhist term, there's a Buddhist term for this, maybe someone knows it, but having had a sense of the destination that you're trying, where you're trying to get in terms of, I know you're not supposed to strive as a meditator, but we all do. That having had that, having a glimpse, a sample of that kind of consciousness makes it easier to achieve it. So I think there are very rich possibilities here. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
My name is Yogi. I'm an environmental philosopher, and I have two intertwined questions. Just last week, I organized the 18th Annual Biosemiotics Gathering at UC Berkeley with your colleague Terence Mckenna. Mm-hmm. And in biosemiotics, we basically look at a hermeneutics of biology. So you've said several interesting pieces about, the dangers of approaching these experiences outside of a context, and of how microdosing is, could be just part of this workism of a capitalist network, etc. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I'm very curious about your seemingly middle-of-the-road stance on science, and of, we're talking about psychologists and psychiatrists giving these experiences, but if you went to Latin America and actually dealt with people who have been working with these medicines for thousands of years, they would say, here it's the blind leading the blind. So Richard Doyle at the Penn State University has coined the term ecodelic because he talks about the ecological part of any psychedelic experience as being extremely important. And of course, that's everything that we bring in beforehand historically, but also our lived environment. And as somebody who cares so much for nature, as you and I do, I'm very curious about why you don't go sort of a Isabel Stenger's way of thinking about science as part of the problem that's gotten us to this point of this mental health epidemic that has required these plants and mushrooms to come back into our lives in order to make us realize that this path ultimately of third phase trials, etc., may not be the only way, the only verifiable and valid way to knowledge that is in fact harming our society.
Thank you for your question. Your question is essentially, why don't I agree with your worldview? Which is fine. And I don't know that I don't. I mean, I think you have to read the book to see that I do privilege science in some ways in the book, but the book contains several different ways of looking at a psychedelic, science being one of them, and a really important one in my view, because it's yielding a lot of interesting information. Science is valuable to the extent that it gives us useful information, and it doesn't always. And in all my work, I work very hard to layer different perspectives. And I'm technically a science writer. I hold a chair in science journalism at Berkeley, but I actually, till I got that chair, I didn't think of myself as a science writer. I think sometimes the poets get there first, sometimes the philosophers get there first, and that a valuable account of anything depends on multiple perspectives. So you'll see there's a chapter on neuroscience, but there are chapters on history, and there are chapters on phenomenology. I mean, the fact is that I talk a lot about the limitations of science in its inability to penetrate consciousness, right? The subjective experience of what it's like to be you. Science has nothing to say about that. They know how to turn it off. That's about it. And so you need phenomenology, right? You need people's accounts of what happens. So there's a role for the writer and the poet in understanding the psychedelic experience. So all of which is to say, I'm open to what you're saying, and the book does not say that science is the only way to understand these experiences, or that it's sensitive to the limitations of science as well. So see if you still feel that way after you read it.
Thank you.
I'm afraid this next question will be the last one, so that we have time for people to have their books signed downstairs and we stay on schedule. So
Make it a good one.
make it a good one.
Won't be like that.
No pressure.
That's a question to follow. My question for you is in your experience coming to these guided meditations and these guided trip experiences, as somebody that's not coping with loss or going through dealing with cancer, in the integration sessions afterwards, how do you find that it's easy to carry your takeaways into your everyday life going forward, or do you have some tool that you use to kind of remind yourself of what your big takeaway was?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, the one I talked about, I went through this with my guide. I described this experience of ego dissolution. I didn't really describe it in great detail, but that was a powerful experience. And the next day I went back and met with my guide to talk about it. And I told her what had happened, that I'd realized, there's another ground on which to stand and face life that isn't your ego, and that you can stand somewhere else. And that was, I thought that was kind of big. And she said, yeah, isn't that worth the price of admission? And I said, yeah, I guess it was. But on the other hand, now my ego, I'm back to baseline. My ego's back in uniform, on patrol. Yeah. So what good was that? And that's a big question. How do these experiences get carried forward? And she said, well, you've had a taste of that other way of being, a somewhat less defended way of being, a somewhat less egocentric way of being, and you can cultivate that. And I asked her how, and she said meditation. And that is certainly one way I've worked to cultivate it. But as we understand learning, learning is the exercise of circuits in the brain. And so you have these new circuits that are temporarily created. If you have the book in your lap, look at page 318. And you'll see a wiring chart of the brain on a placebo and the brain on psilocybin. And all those lines are, in the psychedelic one, are new lines of connection between networks. Around the edge of the circle are the different brain networks. It's wonderful being able to do this. It's like teaching a class in school with the textbook. But the point is, having had that experience of this non-egoic consciousness, that's in my mind somewhere. So the challenge is, how do you exercise it? And the more, it's the same with depression or addiction. You're exercising a negative loop, right? But they're positive loops too. And so the more you think about it, the more you exercise that kind of being, the more it becomes part of you. It becomes something you've learned. That at least is the theory of what mental learning is. And so all the psychedelics do is create temporarily new lines, new connections. And then it's up to us to exercise them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your great question. Thank you, Michael.
I want to, first of all, thank you all for coming. And secondly, to say 3 organizations, Point Reyes Books, Mesa Refuge, and Commonweal, contributed to this. So I want to ask you to patronize Point Reyes Books. Yes. I want to ask you to give to Mesa Refuge. And I'd like to ask you to support the new school at Commonweal. What makes this possible is your support. That's how the new school works. So thank you, Michael Pollan, for a brilliant,